Good evening and welcome to this two-part webinar series from Broadleaf Books and Fortress Press. We will be discussing this topic of breaking point, tracing the roots of white Christian nationalism and how we can resist. I'm Dr. Laura Gifford. I'm a books editor with Fortress Press and a historian of American politics, so I'm delighted to be able to moderate this conversation. Tonight, we're discussing the rise of white Christian nationalism and its impact on society, including its propensity for violence, like that which we saw on January 6, 2021, and the ways it perpetuates racism and xenophobia. By examining its history and facing these uncomfortable truths, we aim to foster a deeper understanding of white Christian nationalism and inspire you to take proactive steps to counter its harmful influence. So let's meet tonight's panelists. First joining us, we have the Reverend Angela Denker, who is a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and a veteran journalist. She is the author of Red State Christians, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind, and the forthcoming Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. Angela lives in Minneapolis, where she is a sought-after speaker on Christian nationalism and its theological and cultural roots. So welcome, Angela. Next joining us, we have Greg Jarrell. Greg is a cultural organizer with QC Family Tree in the Enderley Park neighborhood of Charlotte, North Carolina. He works with words and music to impact housing and neighborhood justice issues. Jarrell writes about theology and history and is the author of Our Trespasses, White Churches and the Taking of American Neighborhoods. Hello, Greg.
Hey, Laura. Thank you for having me on. Hello, Angela.
Our third panelist is Dr. Bradley Onishi. Brad is a scholar of religion and co-host of the Straight White American Jesus podcast and is graciously going to be using the audio from this particular webinar on that podcast. So thank you to Brad for that. He is the author of Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next, a TEDx speaker and the author, editor, or translator of 4 previous books. Onishi teaches at the University of San Francisco. So thanks for joining us, Brad.
Yeah, good to be here.
And finally, we have Amanda Tyler. Amanda is an attorney, executive director of Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, and lead organizer of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She also co-hosts the Respecting Religion podcast. Tyler is the author of How to End Christian Nationalism. She lives in Texas. Welcome this evening, Amanda.
Oh, thank you. So great to be with you all.
So thank you all for being here. We have a lot to cover tonight. I was joking, I know, before the conversation that with one of you, we could easily fill an hour, and we've got a lot of wonderful material to discuss in this hour we have together tonight. To get the conversation started, we have a general question that I'd love to posit to each of you about what precipitated your work of writing about and working against white Christian nationalism, and also a kind of a two-part question, what most concerns you about the rise of white Christian nationalism right now? So the reason why you're doing this, what especially concerns you as we gather together here on August 1st. So Angela, how about if we start with you?
Sure. Well, always hard to be the first one to go. I like to hear everyone else first. But I guess I am sort of the grizzled veteran here in Christian nationalism in some ways. When I first began working on Red State Christians, I was not real familiar with Christian nationalism and the threat it poses. And it was with the reporting for that book undertaken mostly in the year of 2018 after my service in a conservative evangelical style Lutheran in name megachurch in Southern California in Orange County, where I witnessed the rise of Fascism within evangelical churches down there back in Brad's old stomping grounds. So it was doing that research when I just became convinced that, wow, not only is Christian nationalism going to be the first chapter of this book, but it is permeating every single section of the book. And again, ancient history, almost 5 years ago, Red State Christians first came out. And since that time, I've continued to watch the growth, the perniciousness of Christian nationalism, the resistance, which I'm so grateful that has been spawned. But I've become increasingly more and more concerned. And every single day, there's another story, another place in our politics where this threat continues to rise. So I've been grateful to continue to do this work and to see it from small town Minnesota, where I pastored, to the White House. So it's really in every corner of so many of our lives and in our families and our communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And with that Orange County sort of connection, I wonder, Brad, if you'd like to step in next. We've kind of got a geographic affinity here in some ways in terms of the roots of potential interest.
Sure. I basically grew up in the neighborhood. I mean, my brothers went to preschool at the church where Angela was pastoring. So it's not a 45-minute sort of, separation. It's like a literal connection there. So I think for me, there's a couple things. One, I think with all of us, the last 10 years have been shocking, have been surprising, have been disturbing. And I wanted to help folks see that from my view, which is bifocal. Somebody who lived it, somebody who was an evangelical minister in a mega church that I would call Christian nationalist, somebody who's now a scholar of religion who studies these things from the outside and perhaps could provide a historical view on things. And in addition, a story about a part of the country that's often viewed as liberal, as progressive, as not prone to the impulses and temptations of Christian nationalism and other fundamentalisms and nationalistic movements, but nonetheless has been an epicenter for those things, and that's Southern California and Orange County. And so all of those things together really precipitated me writing. In addition to January 6th, which as I watched, as a scholar of religion, I noticed all the religious symbols and imagery. As a former Christian nationalist evangelical, I thought perhaps I would have been there. If I was 19 and there had been a man in my church who said, we need to go to the Capitol this week and make sure God's will is done. Here's a plane ticket. 19-year-old me might have been on that plane. So all of that led to writing the book. And I think what concerns me now is things have only gotten more extreme and more violent. I think we've reached a place where Christian nationalists are done trying to persuade and are ready to simply take. And I think that's pretty alarming. And it's hard to think we've come to a place that's different and worse than January 6, 2021. However, I think we have, which is pretty alarming.
Yeah, definitely. And your mention of geography just leads me to wonder, Greg, if you would like to step in next, because it feels as though certainly the focus of your book is a little bit different, Greg, but the ways that geography, that place, all of these factors in turn factor into experiences that we're having as Americans across the country feels really relevant.
Yeah, for sure. I think the influences, we see the stuff that we see on television that really kind of captures our imaginations is underwritten geographically in the ways that our cities and our landscapes have been built. And that's kind of been my attention. My work sort of came about trying to understand the takeover of my own neighborhood, having lived in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Charlotte, mostly Black, in sort of a Catholic worker environment, and sort of watching white evangelicals kind of seize the space around us, and tracing that back to urban renewal and to some other, like, there are a lot of through lines that move through this work. And as somebody who grew up in the Southern Baptist Convention, but now as a progressive Baptist, I've sort of seen through my work the ways that all of the white progressives aren't innocent within kind of laying the groundwork for all of this as well. So that's been some of the stuff that I've noted and has really interested me. And as the father of 16 and 14-year-old boys, watching the ways that young men in particular have been kind of captured, young white men, by this, then my senses are heightened around this as well.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's an opportunity to follow that up as given Angela's recent writing and so on. again, though, the Baptist connection, and also then hearing from somebody in Amanda who's working with all of this right in the locus of power in Washington, D.C. and beyond. I'm curious to hear what precipitated your work and also what concerns you in particular, given the connections and avenues in which you're operating at the moment.
Yeah, well, I very much came to this work because of both my personal and my professional life. You know, personally, growing up as a Baptist in Texas and being an active lay leader and watching my family be active lay leaders and just having that strong connection to church polity. But then also professionally, after a career in law and politics and government, in 2017, I came to lead the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, this 88-year-old education and advocacy group that is headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. And so it was early on, I came to lead the organization 2 weeks before Donald Trump was inaugurated to the presidency, and seeing all of these attacks on religious freedom and how we protect religious freedom in this country by being sure that we ensure the separation of church and state. But seeing that it wasn't just the legal principles that were under attack, but that people were actually under attack in houses of worship. And the violence that was coming brought and fueled by Christian nationalism and then aided by guns, so that people were no longer safe in their house of worship. And so it was really that impetus that led me at Baptist Joint Committee, working with my colleagues there and interfaith colleagues and ecumenical colleagues, to form the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, really identifying Christian nationalism as the single biggest threat to religious freedom in this country right now, back in 2019. And so, you know, much like Brad said, we were positioned then by the time January 6th happened to really recognize those symbols as not just the symbols of Christianity at the insurrection, but actually the symbols of Christian nationalism. And since then, watching this campaign evolve into something that really provided a way for people to take action in their local communities. So that led me to write this book that's really a handbook for anyone, but particularly for Christians who are looking to know what to do when they are looking to dismantle Christian nationalism from themselves, their theologies, their congregations, and their broader communities. And in the midst of that, and in fact, in the midst of writing this book, my family moved from Washington, D.C. back to Texas. And that experience has given me a new appreciation for how Christian nationalism is really thriving in certain areas of this country, and by certain legislatures and other leaders that are really exploiting this ideology in order to further exclusionary policies. So what concerns me the most at really watching how this ideology has evolved over the last 7 years now that I've been really working intently on it, is just how we risk the normalization of Christian nationalism. When we started out, this was something that most everyone would at least distance themselves from the term or the knowledge of it. And now over time, we've had more and more people, including leaders at the top of government, embracing the term and embracing the concept of something that the country should be. And that is such an urgent threat to both American democracy, but also to an authentic Christian witness.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you all for sharing that motivation and a little bit of where you're finding your particular points of concern as we're moving into the current election season and all its ever-changing glory. I anticipate 5 new developments by the end of the hour at the rate that we're going now in society. But the books that each of you have written also delve more deeply and personally and specifically into how Christian nationalism functions, how both problems and possibilities can emerge from having the sort of deeper knowledge that comes from really studying this phenomenon. I wondered, and throughout, feel very welcome to lodge questions of each other. This is something that we can have as a flowing conversation. But perhaps to get us started into that more specific realm, Angela, you alluded to the fact that, and this is quoting from Red State Christians, the unlikely love affair between Red State Christians and Trump comes down to a shared language, which I felt was very poignant and maybe gets us into this question of how to engage, how to think about the ways that we are active in society engaging this concern. I was wondering if you could speak more to that and to how opponents of white Christian nationalism might address this issue of language.
Yeah, well, language is really important to me as a writer, as a journalist, as a preacher. And so I was really struck by the ways in which, when I would interview people, for writing Red State Christians, I spent 2018 traveling across the country from Appalachia to many places in Texas, US-Mexico border, down to Florida to meet with Trump's pastor, Paula White. But I was really struck by the appeals that Trump would make to these different constituencies through language. And at the time, many of these appeals that I was really struck by had to do with class. And while Donald Trump comes from a wealthy family in Manhattan, he went to an Ivy League college, he had sort of this gut level ability to transcend what people would consider as elite political language, and to speak in some sense to the folks who I would interview in small town rural America, folks in Appalachia. And, things like he would talk about going to get a Big Mac. He'd talk about McDonald's. He'd talk about, and all of these ways, these were very early days, were ways of making connection. My thinking on this as these years have passed by has shifted a bit. And it's no longer, these were very early ways to form sort of a heart connection and trust with his voters. And one of the things that I always talk about when I meet with groups of people who are wanting to push back against Christian nationalism is I talk about rebuilding trust. Because what Trump did on a very gut level, and what many Christian nationalist leaders seek to do, is they build trust with people over creating seeming commonalities. But what I would say today that I got to address a bit in the new version of Red State Christians in 2022, but what I'll write about much more extensively in Disciples of White Jesus, is that so many of these shared appeals are about commonalities over who we hate. So you're certainly seeing this with the language that Republicans, that Christian nationalists are using when they talk about Vice President Kamala Harris. And so I was thinking about this example from Trump's interview yesterday at the NABJ, National Association of Black Journalists, their convention. He said he's asked if Kamala Harris is a DEI candidate. And his answer here, you can see again the slippery way that he uses language. And I won't do this today because we have a whole lot of other people to talk to. But I want to flag for people that there's an object lesson on this in the Bible. It's in John 18, 31 through 38. And this is a lesson in the ways in which Pontius Pilate, with Jesus in dialogue, Pontius Pilate does the same thing that I see many Christian nationalists and I see Trump doing, which is slipping around conversation to deny the existence of truth, to avoid directly answering a question, but to create a shared affinity over who we hate, who we dislike, who is not us. And so I saw Trump doing that in a hate-filled, racist way when he was asked about Kamala Harris being a DEI candidate. First, he says, well, you need to define it. And so the interviewer, Rachel Scott, says, well, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then he keeps but what define it? What does that mean? It's this attempt to skirt around an idea that there is a truth that you can hold on to. And then he kind of ends up landing on this thing that he has done in many cases where he says, well, she could be. I don't know. Some people might think she is. What he's doing in those answers is giving permission for people to indulge in sort of that devil on your shoulder of, well, I really want to have somebody to blame for the things I'm maybe legitimately upset about. And I want to be able to indulge in thinking about the differences that I have with other people. I want to engage in white supremacy. And so I think that language really comes down to, in many cases, a language that is a dog whistle to racism, to sexism, to classism, but specifically to white supremacist ideology that we see not just in Trump, but we're seeing in somebody like J.D. Vance as well. So much more to unpack there. But I continue to see it over and over again. And it's a very slippery way at undermining trust, building up anger and rage and violence, which again is a big thing to talk about with the role of young men in this movement and the role of radicalization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder, given that segue, whether Brad, you'd have comments on this notion of language from your lived experience as well as scholarly background, and also the reality that you discuss quite eloquently, how white Christian nationalist followers are everyday people in communities like Orange County, just as you'd articulated earlier, and that you could have been there in DC on January 6th, that it's not really that far of a stretch. And sometimes I do think we tend to put these things in categories, which, as Angela was alluding to, is far from that easy in reality. But I'm curious to hear more from you about this idea of really everyday people caught up in these communities, in this language and shared affinity for the language and the ideology, and how that might, of course, be a cause for concern, also perhaps potentially a cause for hope. How you'd recommend that listeners be thinking about all of this?
Yeah, I think got a noisy air conditioner is what I think. I think that Angela touched on language. Hold on. All right, there we go. Angela touched on language, and I want to touch on a related but I think distinct aspect to that, which is narrative and story. So I think that whether it's the person in Appalachia, whether it's the person in Baton Rouge, or whether it's the person in Orange County, I think what Christian nationalism does, including Donald Trump, is to give people a story to live out. It invites them into a narrative, and it gives them a character to play in that story. And I think within that story, you're able to do exactly what Angela just talked about, which is to unite with good guys and fight the bad guys. You create enemies that are not just your political opponent who doesn't agree with you about how the mayor should run the town or what we should do with our school dollars as a PTA, but they're actual demons. They are Satan fueled actors who want to destroy America, who hate children, who want to eat children, who want to be groomers, who want to be perverts, whatever rhetoric we hear. And so I think the invitation into a story is a way that we can understand how these common enemies, these common foes start to appear. And so we can see someone like J.D. Vance, who is from Appalachia, he says, and a recent convert to a very reactionary strain of Catholicism, uniting with the likes of mega church pastors, from Robert Jeffress to Tony Perkins. For 50, 60 years, we've had reactionary Catholics and white evangelicals as co-belligerents in the ways that Francis Schaeffer and Jerry Falwell would say, against these common enemies that Angela's talked about. One of the hard parts about running against someone who tells a story that way, that they will make America great again, is that they are promising something they can't deliver, but it doesn't matter. It's inviting, it's tantalizing, and it's a promise to fix you, promise to fix your community, a promise to fix your life, a promise to get the people you think have ruined it. And so it's really hard to run against that kind of person because you're never going to be able to promise as much as they are. And the story they're telling is way more epic than the one you're going to tell. about living a quotidian life as citizens of a democracy, trudging along, trying to be neighbors, trying to figure it out together in a way that's peaceful, in ways that we can flourish and learn and grow. That's much more difficult to get the hairs to stand on end when you deliver a message to people. Where is there hope there? There's hope there because eventually the fascist narrative evaporates and you see it for what it is. It's a reality star television 78-year-old man with more makeup and hair gel on than one can imagine, promising that he'll fix you in the world, and you realize he's lying and he looks like a buffoon. And so to me, the hope is you continue to tell the real story, the story of it's possible for us to live together as in a multiracial, multi-religious, pluralistic democracy, to struggle together, to try to live in a way that is full of sharing power, and that is not totalizing, that is not exclusionary, that is not violent. And you continue to have hope in that story, and you realize that history tells us someday that fascist demagogue will appear to the masses what he really is, which is a lying buffoon, and the gig will be up. But it's really a lot of work and a lot of belief to get to that point, and I think that's where we are. We're right in the middle of that.
Hey, Laura, can I jump in about this?
Forward.
Yeah. So for one, I appreciate you just naming it fascism, Brad. I think that's clearer language sometimes than sort of some of the new speak that comes along. That's what we're facing, and fascism, obviously, in my work, has spatial orientations. You know, this question over birthright citizenship that all of a sudden has got some salience within this community. It is one evidence of that. I also think that in terms of telling a different story and sort of taking the power out, it's been very interesting over the past 10 days to see that the narrative has shifted a bit just through ridicule, like just through calling these folks weirdos, which seems so anodyne, and not to say that they're not dangerous, but also like these are genuinely weird people with really obtuse and unbelievable kind of beliefs that have started to be poked through in some ways. It's really kind of changed the dominant narrative. Just they don't feel so inevitable. It's like we're not handing them all the power just by fulfilling their narrative about talking about how dangerous they are, so that has been a really interesting development to me over the last few days.
And I appreciate, Brad, your naming narrative as well. And what comes to mind for me is a narrative of America as a Christian nation that does create belonging for some people, but it also creates a sense of insider-outsider status. And it seems like we've all kind of gone to the current moment that we're in. And I was reminded of the acceptance speech that J.D. Vance gave at the Republican National Convention, in which he disagreed with the whole nation that what defines America is an ideal. Some of these foundational ideals that I think many people do cling to. Ideals that have never been realized, but provide a framework, I believe, for that kind of radical inclusion, that everyone belongs, no matter how they identify religiously, whether or not they are a Christian or from another faith or are not religious at all. That's the promise of America, and that's the ideal of religious freedom. But in his speech, he explicitly said that that's not what America is about, but rather that America is about a land, and a land that his people have lived on for generations. Ignoring altogether the doctrine of discovery that was, of course, infused with Christian nationalism that justified the taking of the land to begin with, but defining America based on who lives here and has lived here for generations. which again is this implicit reminder of white Christian nationalism, of who really belongs here. And so I think when we think about countering Christian nationalism, we have to counter with a narrative that provides true belonging for everyone, regardless of any of their identities, including their religious identity.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. And I want to take off my clergy collar and put on my journalist hat for a moment as we're talking about narrative, because media companies are right at the center of all of this, and journalists are right at the center of all of this, and social media companies are right at the center of all of it. And much of the way that we see the world now as Americans and as citizens of the world is mediated through algorithms, and those algorithms are prioritized according to, most popularly, what makes us rage, what makes us angry. And so when you're trying to push forward an alternative narrative, you're up against not only the violence and the ideology and the powerful history of fascism, of authoritarianism, but you're also up against a profit motive. And we see that profit motive with the selection of J.D. Vance, who was promoted by Silicon Valley. And again, these odd marriages between old school Southern Baptist, God and country type, folks marrying with somebody like Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, people who have really no interest in the Bible, in social teachings, but they're very interested in profit and in money. And so the profit motive is right at the center of this narrative, which I think makes it all together so much more remarkable and hopeful that there has been a bit of a shift in the type of narrative that people are willing to believe in. And I do think some of that is this generational change and this movement of Joe Biden to do something which Christian nationalists could never conceive of, which is somebody who has power voluntarily giving up that power, not for their own personal good, but for the good of the country and for the good of someone else. It was a move that I thought really had potential to change and to shake up this narrative. And I really think that we've seen that it has, because of that movement of sacrifice. It opens up a whole world of possibilities that for people who have grown up, in the 80s, in the 90s, we've seen 9/11, we've seen, Bill Clinton's scandal, we've seen our politicians not live up to what you would hope for of honor, of grace, of honesty. And there's so much cynicism, and cynicism goes far on social media too. So this move of Joe Biden to do something to voluntarily give up power, I just think was a real move in an antithesis of a Christian nationalist narrative that has had the power to change the conversation in America, particularly for younger Americans.
Yeah. I'm struck, and I appreciate you bringing media into this, because I think the ways we tell our stories make such an important difference and have evolved so significantly. I'm also thinking back to Amanda's comments about land and place, and some of what J.D. Vance had to say about land and place in contrast to the ideals of American democracy that I think would be the thing that we would assume would be the foundation that he ignored. This feels like an opening, Greg, for a little bit of conversation about how urban renewal in cities and towns links into all of this, how understanding the history of our place can influence our capacity to tell our stories, to perhaps tell better stories, to challenge and assert a different narrative that subverts some of what we're seeing as problems and adds to this well of maybe the cracks of possibility.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think the unfortunate kind of reality about, speaking of Vance and some of the some of the ways that these fascist beliefs kind of come through is that they do have a lot of historical continuity with the way that in actual practice this country's politics has worked. So I've studied in particular urban renewal, which was a giant land grab, and it was a land grab that was done for the last half of that program at the same time that the civil rights movement was actively going on. So I think it's very easy to read it as at least a portion of it as a backlash against the organizing that was going on during the Southern Freedom Movement. And so I think at least seeing those roots and the continuity with those roots, and sort of for me, it was important to examine like who was participating, how were Christians participating and conceiving, and it was liberal Christians, liberal white Christians, along with conservative white Christians that were all actively involved in this, in acting out what a friend of mine says about racism, that it's a way of taking people from land and land from people. And that really salient point, I think, comes through in a lot of the discourse that we hear now with the subject that we're talking about tonight. But it pervades the history of white settlement on this continent. And it moves across the usual conservative and liberal divides. Like all of us who have inherited these traditions, like that's still in that point is still in there. It's still the water that we swim in. So we still have work to do around it.
But I'll just jump in and say I don't think Vance's comments were by any means an accident. They were really in step with so many of the common good conservatism Catholics that he is influenced by, who don't believe, and along with white nationalists, along with so many of the kind of reformed Christian nationalist types from Doug Wilson to Stephen Wolfe, who really believe that a creedal nation based on ideals is not possible. And thus, the only way to have a country is to have a Volk, right? As Stephen Wolfe puts it, a people based on land, based on a sense of nationhood, based on a sense of ethnicity. And so there's a really, we hear so often from politicians these tired lines of we have a choice to go forward or to go back. But what Vance does is present us with this idea of, is the United States a place based on some sense of who belongs, based on land, based on who controls the land, based on who's been here, though his partner and her family has a very recent immigration story, and he has biracial, multiracial children. Nonetheless, he talks like this. Or are we, right, a country that is doing something harder and more beautiful and rarely attempted in the history of the human species, and that is a type of community based on a set of ideals that are lofty and difficult to live out, and nonetheless provide us with people who are multiracial, who have multiple religions in their homes, different symbols, different heritage, that have, who knows what they're eating for dinner because they've come from different grandmas from across the world. And there's a texture and a mosaic and just an absolute beauty to the entanglement of all of these stories together in a way that can make the United States appear to be something of an audacious experiment. But, we can live that one, or we can live like scared little humans who resort to skin and what's familiar and who lives here and who doesn't, and say, we'll just build our nation based on that, because we don't have the guts to live out the beauty and the wonder that was proposed in an American founding that has never been lived out yet, but a more perfect union might be possible. So for me, that's the narrative that says, of course, going forward is something we want to talk about, but that's what going forward means. It means going forward to something that's a lot scarier, but a lot more beautiful. And isn't that what being human is? Rather than resorting to something that reduces us to scared little organisms huddled together in ways that are violent and really small. I think we want to be bigger than that, and I think that's what it means to go forward. So when I think about stories and the stories I want to tell to potential voters, to young people, to those young men who are 23 and think that you can't be a man unless you vote for Donald Trump, or those young folks who are like, I don't know what the story of this country is. It seems to be just the doctrine of discovery and chattel slavery and Chinese exclusion. Why the hell should I be proud of it? We have to find a way to say, well, yeah, all that's there. It's all there, and it's gross, but it doesn't mean there's not something else possible.
And to that possibility, Brad, I think we talked about what's the opportunity here. There is an awakening to the danger of Christian nationalism in our current moment. And it does require bravery. It requires really being honest about our history. And Greg, I loved how you brought in the fact that this is a problem across Christian life. It is not just a white evangelical problem as we sometimes hear about it, but it is something that is pervasive in Christian life. And if we have the bravery to really face history with eyes wide open, then we can realize where we have been departing, speaking from a Christian perspective, where Christians have been departing from the teachings of Jesus in service to the power of Christian nationalism for centuries. So not only could we achieve the ideals of the American project, but we could also grow more close to Jesus in the process as we reject Christian nationalism in favor of Christianity. And I was also just struck by how many times you said scared or fear. And we have to know that that's what's driving this push towards authoritarianism or fascism, as we talked about, that with the chaos that is going on around the country and around the world. When we look at what's happening with the climate, when we're looking at what's happening with violence and war, that's when we are all most susceptible to the allure of authoritarianism, the easy answers of a strong person who would say, we can just do this by making Christianity the law of the land, that will solve all of our problems, when in fact it will draw us, of course, further away from the kind of multiracial democracy that we say we want to have.
One of the questions that we received from subscribers who signed on to these webinars was one that really juxtaposes well with, I think, where our conversation sits at the moment. And that is the question of how and what, particularly for those of us who identify as Christians or have a contextual background that includes Christianity, what responsibilities we might have or how we might operate with the reality that this is a pluralistic society and there are people who are religious minorities, not of varying stripes, who are coping with these messages. What would we say to those people? What are the responsibilities perhaps that we who are engaging this question bear toward society in terms of the really distinctive sorts of fears and concerns of people who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Hindu, who are identifying with any number of other religious faiths?
Well, I often approach, I'll take it first, I guess. I often approach that question thinking about impact and responsibility, that the impact of white Christian nationalism is most felt by people who aren't Christian or people who are people of color or both. Right? But white Christians, therefore, might feel the least impact day to day on white Christian nationalism. Not that they don't feel some, because white Christian nationalism draws this circle of belonging so tight that it excludes many white Christians as well. But as a generality, that we feel it the least, but yet we bear the greatest responsibility, both in examining how it's impacted our own theologies and our own ways of being, but also in advocating on behalf of equality and on behalf of all of our neighbors. And what I write about in the book is acknowledging that will lead to a loss of power and privilege. and being able to reckon with that, but realizing that this is not a zero-sum game, that to give up supremacy in our society does not mean a loss for us, but rather is a gain for everyone. And so that is why I wrote my book, particularly to Christians and even more specifically to white Christians, to encourage them to take on that responsibility.
Yeah, I would really resonate with a lot of what Amanda's saying. And as a female clergy member, I'm often like, I'm not in on the Christian nationalists for many of them. I'm one of the people that they want to draw the dividing line on, you can't be part of our group. And at the same time, as a white Christian and my experience in pastoring, I have experienced many of the privileges of white Christianity in this country. And I think where I see some of the hope is, not only in the many times that I'm called into churches, and not only to liberal churches, often to churches that would see themselves as more politically conservative or in conservative environments. People want to talk about these things. All you guys who are here listening to this tonight and watching it later, that's a huge source of hope, that people want to engage and want to have conversations. And I would, again, echo Amanda's comments that those conversations really start with your own communities, your churches, your families. And many times it's not a debate. It's not a rational argument, but it's a sense of rebuilding trust. It's setting your own boundaries over, these are things that I'm not okay with being said in my presence, and having the confidence to draw those lines. But to find ways not to sever the relationship. And many times it's like working through the process of 12-step recovery, and through that process of, when somebody is ready to step away from this ideology, that they know you're there to be there to catch them, to have these conversations. But finally, kids, the next generation, gives me a lot of hope. My kids are in the Minneapolis public schools, and we have to, as white Christians, we have to realize, hey, they made a choice that we're going to take off not just the Christian holidays. So we have a lot of days throughout the school year when, like, oh, it's a Wednesday, and I wasn't expecting that the kids are going to be off, but it's a Jewish high holy day, or it's Eid for Muslim students. And so I think that's been a growing pain on the part of, many white Christians and white Christian parents in the school district. But I also get to see my son, with one of his friends who's Jewish, and they're having a conversation as 8-year-olds about, well, what does it mean when you wear the Star of David? What does it mean when somebody wears a cross necklace? And those kind of conversations are the same, cross-religious conversations that Jesus was having in his religiously pluralistic context as a Jewish man. So I think for Christians to hearken back to that story and to realize the context of Jesus is really powerful.
Yeah. That's an interesting example of sort of how this can operate at the local level too. And I'm curious, one thing that I've been thinking of asking Amanda, and I'll go ahead and lob this as we're coming into our last several minutes, is how you write that this is something that affects us most at a local level, even as white Christian nationalism is a national problem, and we've spent a lot of time clearly talking about the national context. Could you say more about why that's so, and what both dangers and opportunities that might bring? And others might have thoughts on this too. This question of Christian nationalism at the local level.
Well, from a policy perspective, it's just the way that our system is built. With a limited federal government, limited powers, much of the powers reserved to the states and the localities. And with changes at the U.S. Supreme Court, that has become even more so. So we see, for example, the taking away of abortion rights, and then that being pushed down to the states. And so more and more, the decisions that most impact people's lives are made not by the president or by the Congress or even by the Supreme Court, but by their local authorities and their state legislatures. And so because of that, we are seeing also a divide between how people's rights are protected in this country from state to state. And so even though Christian nationalism as an ideology is in every community in this country, we're seeing certain areas that are more impacted than others. And so we really, if we're going to succeed in this movement to dismantle Christian nationalism, we have to learn to recognize how it's impacting people at the local level, whether it be at their city council or their school board or their state legislature, and give people tools to help advocate against it. And also, as Angela was saying, to build those relationships with people in our communities, to have greater understanding of religious diversity, and of how people exist in this country, even bring their morality even without a religious perspective at all, and have greater appreciation for the beautiful diversity of people in this country. And that is what will help, I think, more than anything, to dismantle it. And so in my book, I really give people tools and examples of how to advocate, including this very urgent issue of Christian nationalism being pushed through the public schools, but also encourage people to join local organizing projects to really discern and work together in their communities about fashioning interventions away from Christian nationalism and towards that inclusive democracy that we're all fighting for.
Yeah, and I think as you look back in history, you would see that all of the successful multiracial democratic resistance movements have always started locally at municipal levels or at state levels. I think specifically of the fusion movement in North Carolina in the late 1890s. There were some parallel movements in Virginia and other southern states that were really, really deeply important, energetic, multiracial organizing that started at the local level. And, that's ultimately, that's where our hope is going to begin with as we try to push against this.
Definitely. Well, perhaps to wrap us up, I'll lodge the question that I gave you all in advance as sort of the final thought experiment for our hour. And this is predicated upon the reality that so many of us are living in pluralistic environments, but many more of us are living in environments that are fairly strongly tilted ideologically one way and another. And for those who are swimming in very much white Christian nationalist or anti-white Christian nationalist waters, perhaps folks who aren't uber activists or even really would be knowledgeable to speak to this, but are moving and living in circles that are infused with these ideologies. So a really conservative place, a really liberal place. I'm coming to you all from Portland, Oregon. So that would be the anti-white Christian nationalism, but can have its own problems, right? As we seek to be a country together and talk about these things knowledgeably. What's one thing that you wish you could share with someone, either in super white Christian nationalist or super anti-white Christian nationalist waters, based upon all that you've researched and learned about this and the continuing thinking you do about this issue? And I'll just throw it out there that anyone who'd like to respond can.
Well, I'll go first. I would just want them to know that they're not alone. When we look at Christian nationalism as an ideology, the latest research is that those who are most embracing Christian nationalism are a minority of the people. And even those who are just, kind of accommodating it, when it's really less than 30% of the American population. So the majority of people are rejecting in some way this ideology. And so there are more of us than you might think. And there are ways to find people who you might find community and belonging and support in what is this brave act of pushing back against Christian nationalism, particularly if you're in a place that is more saturated by it. And so I would reach out and look for tools There are many, including the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. We've recently launched a community group on Facebook that is really growing very fast, where people are being able to kind of talk to each other and share information about Christian nationalism no matter where they are. So my message is just, you're not alone, and find other people who are looking to do this work with you.
Yeah, I would just echo that and say it feels really good to do things, which is not any sort of ingenious idea, but it's true. It's easy to sit behind a screen. It's easy to scroll under the bed and eat French fries and be sad about the world. Not speaking from personal experience at all. And so I think when we gather with folks who are working towards something that seems to be important, to be just, to be a project that leads to a better world, it feels good. And I always just say, I challenge you to do one thing you're not doing yet. What's a thing that you haven't taken the leap to do, whether that's writing postcards, whether that's joining a group every Tuesday that is, organizing around something related to your school board, whatever it may be. Not only will that make an impact, as Amanda talked about earlier, but it will feel better than being at home, worried about the ways that the world and the country seem to be in danger.
Yeah.
I think it's important that this, again, like, this is not inevitable. It's not, and it can be resisted. It can be resisted with both like serious organizing and with joy and sort of alternative kind of ways of living and organizing our lives together. So to me, I think that's the most important thing. Just not to give it more power than it has. And for those of us, especially who've been racialized as white, the rest of the country has lived under fascist or proto-fascist rules at many times in the past, and found ways of resistance, and even when they lost, of creating some sense of thriving despite their political weakness. And so there are plenty of resources out there. There are other people who have fought against our folks in the past, and there's plenty for us to learn from them as well.
Yeah, I echo the work of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. I have a bumper sticker on my car, so you can, I believe, get them from the website, and it's a easy, non-confrontational way, I guess, unless somebody's tailgating you, but to spread the message. I want to speak to, my fellow progressive-leaning white Christians and say, this is not a them problem. It's easy to point out and sort of, I see a lot of media making a spectacle out of white Christian nationalism and saying, wow, isn't this so nuts? But the truth is, it's a highly organized, in many cases well-educated, and very well-funded movement that is, home in many Supreme Court justices as well. So this is not, I saw a post on Twitter that suggested that, Trump supporters were toothless. That kind of language and rhetoric of othering this movement, it only allows it to continue to gain power. And so what I would say is, if you think that Christian nationalism is not in your midst, it absolutely is. I have spoken to so many parents of white teenage boys and young men who, would consider themselves very liberal, and all of a sudden they check out their child's YouTube history, and they can't believe the kind of things that they're imbibing and taking in and are influencing them. So I would say that admonition from Jesus to remove the log from our own eye before taking the speck out of someone else's is really the best way to fight this kind of movement. It starts local, it starts in our midst, and it starts with our own self-examination and repentance. And that ancient Christian tradition of repentance and forgiveness for people of many different faiths, is an important starting place And maybe that's my Lutheran pastor thing here, but I'll end on that note.
Fellow rostered Lutheran, totally down with that. But oh, Greg, I saw you are you good? Well, thank you all. That's, I think, a really useful collection of concrete steps and recognitions that this is a problem that is an all of us problem, and we need to be thinking creatively and constructively about these things. So that's all the time we have for today, but what a rich and generative conversation. Thank you to all four of you for sharing your time and your expertise. And thank you to the audience as well for joining us. A recording of tonight's episode will be available soon. Make sure as well that you're following Broadleaf Books and Fortress Press for links and other resources to continue this important work in your own communities. And I know that in the comments, we've posted links to the books by all four of our authors, very much worth picking up and appreciating as you are called. And don't forget to join us as well next week. Same time, same ethereal place. We're continuing this conversation with four more authors and experts: Pamela Cooper White, John Fanistill, Aaron Scott, and Matthew D. Taylor. It should be another wonderful conversation. So thank you again to those watching, and very much to the four of you for participating, and hope you all have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everybody.